Well, tonight is our last Monday Musing of 2020, and I figured we would just finish it off with checking out the origins of some of our favorite holiday plants and kind of maybe gain an appreciation for some of those ancient traditions that have helped kind of shape our holiday in the last several years. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and get started, and of course kind of share some maps and things like that with you to start with to kind of frame tonight's conversation, because if you're like me, you might have forgotten your world history and kind of had to go back and put this timeline together. So when we talk about some of the Christmas traditions and that again have helped shape why and how we celebrate Christmas today, we have to go back to the Vikings, to the Norse culture. We also are going to look a little bit at some of the Celtic traditions and of course the Holy Roman Empire, and both when it was together and then when it split, both sides of that, up to when Jesus was born. And then we're going to follow that through to the Middle Ages. And then, of course, the Protestant Reformation in Europe. And of course, that led to the pilgrims we talked about a few weeks ago coming over to the New World. And so that's kind of where we're going to follow the timeline tonight, if you will. Of course, Christmas started long before the birth of Jesus Christ, because the middle of winter, that's always been a time of celebration. It's been celebrated around the world, again, long before the birth of Jesus Christ. Europeans would celebrate light and birth in the darkest days of winter, and that's what we refer to today as the winter solstice. So when we talk about solstice, we know we have two of those a year, and all that is an astronomical event, and it's caused by the tilt of the earth on its axis and its orbit around the sun. So basically what that gives us here in the northern hemisphere is the shortest day of the year, the shortest day of darkness. So again, back in the days before Christ, that was kind of almost an omen to some of those ancient cultures because they feared that the sun was gone. What were they going to do to get it back? So that's kind of where some of these celebrations and these traditions kind of manifested themselves. Again, we've got proof that even during the Neolithic age, which was many, many thousands of years before Christ, which was the last part of the Stone Age, that humans were celebrating this winter solstice. So there's a lot of these Neolithic monuments that are still in existence today. You have the Newgrange in Ireland. You've got one in Scotland too. I can't remember how to pronounce that word. But all of these are going to be aligned, kind of like you see in the picture here, with the sunrise on the winter solstice day. So this, of course, is Stonehenge. So that's oriented again toward the winter solstice sunset, and there's December rituals that continue to take place there today. So to kind of start us off, I figured we would start out with Yule celebration. And this is coming more to us from a Norse, the Vikings, but up in the Scandinavia area of the world. So just a little poem to kind of get us started. Yule is a time of magic, to burn the Yule log and dance in the firelight. It's a time of song and merriment. It's a time to revere the sun, and it's a time to honor dark, giving way to light. So how this was perceived was that you have a couple of key players. This is the Holly King, and then this is the Oak King. So what basically happened is that this is the time for the Holly King, who is known as the King of Darkness, to do his battle with the Oak King, which is the King of Lightness. So again, this happens twice a year, summer solstice and then here at winter solstice. So the Holly King defeats the Oak King and reigns supreme during the darkest days. But in December, following the winter solstice, the days begin to lengthen, and that's when the Oak King conquers the Holly King. And of course, he reigns during the lightest times. To honor the Oak King, you see acorns here because the oak tree, we've talked a little bit about that in some of our other classes, that it's very revered in many cultures still today. So ancestors of ours coming from those Scandinavian cultures probably still celebrate with oak in some form or fashion at Christmas time. A lot of cultures will still use acorns to make flour, which in turn makes muffins, cakes, or breads. It takes a long time to get a lot of flour out of oaks, but it is a very nice taste. If you've never tried it, I would highly recommend. Of course, decorating your home with boughs of holly, that existed long before the tune came out, or deck the halls with just boughs in general. Evergreen boughs or any evergreen tree to these cultures actually symbolize the rebirth of nature and vegetation. So when they brought it into the home, they felt like that was a special gift to them from the gods, and that they could have something to hold on to that was green, which also in turn represented light and life in return to get them through those dark days of winter. Kind of like maybe 2020's been. We should have all been bringing in evergreen trees since March, mid-March of this year. But just some different ways that would look. Of course, wreaths and pine boughs, some modern interpretations of that today. And of course, pine is going to be one that's going to be utilized quite frequently. Many different ways to use pine, but they would bring it into their homes as well as imbibe the pine, if you will. And again, this is something we talked about in some of our other classes, because it would, again, help alleviate the dark days of winter. Here's one we also talked about in another class. This is the yew. So we know that this one can be a very toxic plant. So be careful with that if you do have pets, but you can use this as an alternative to a Christmas tree, which are what many cultures still do today because of its bright green. It is said to be one of the oldest trees on earth. Many cultures still view that as a sacred plant today. So even throughout ancient Europe, and you can still see these today, yews were planted in churchyards to symbolize a long life. And no Yule celebration would be complete without a bonfire. Bonfire, of course, just from it being light, represented light, yet again. But it was also just an appeal to the sun to warm the earth once again. Some traditions say that it leads to contemplation of the previous year, as well as helping to break bad habits for the new year. So there's some parallels there, some alignment with your New Year's resolutions. So this can be traced back to some of those Scandinavian traditions. So if you were wanting to rid yourself of a bad habit, and this is probably a bad analogy, but taking a cookie and throwing it in the fire to help you lose weight in the new year. Or if you want to look at it from a gardener's perspective for 2021, you could take a seed of something you want to grow and flourish in your garden and put it in the fire. And you will reap benefit from that in the following year. Of course, when we do talk about fire, the thing that accompanies the fire in these Yule traditions is the Yule log. The Norse people actually celebrated Yule on December 21st, or from December 21st through about January 6th or 7th. They would, well, the fathers and son, kind of like you can see in this picture here, they would go out and bring home these really large logs, and you can see how big the logs would be, and they would set them on fire. So basically, the families and the people in those communities would feast the entire time that these Yule logs were burning, and that could take as many as 12 days. So here is the correlation with the 12 days of Christmas. So again, we've got some roots that run back into some of those ancient traditions from that. The Norse people also believed that any spark from that Yule log would actually represent a new pig or a new calf or some type of new livestock for the following year. And so when we talk about that Yule log, traditionally in those cultures at that time, it goes back to the reverence to the oak tree. Most often it was an oak tree, but if they didn't have oak tree, then they would use ash, pine, or birch. But all of those trees, as you've already seen and will see, are still very prevalent in holiday traditions today. When they burn the bough or the Yule, they would decorate it with boughs, evergreen boughs and seeds and berries. This is a really fuzzy picture, but I wanted you to be able to see how they drag that through there, through the communities. But they believed that the ashes from burning the Yule log was also mystical. So a lot of people would spread those on their fields and hoping to encourage fertilization in the spring. And then they always saved a small piece of that log to burn, to use to start the Yule log the following year. And of course, the Yule log, the confection, that comes from that tradition. But the French were the ones that actually made this confection popular. But the reason for that was in the 19th century. We all know that fireplaces were kind of a thing of the past, and we were starting to see an increase in occurrence of heating appliances, even the different types of wood stoves even that we had at the turn of the century. So they basically started trying to use just one log for decoration, and then this was the French's version of that, but this is kind of what we see today. And then of course the Yule log, Yule is pagan. It's one of the pagan holidays. Again, you can see there it is where the 12 days of Christmas come from, because it was celebrated and it's still celebrated today for 12 days. And it's between the winter solstice and all the way through to Yule night. And again, this is a tradition that comes from Scandinavia and the Norse people, but a lot of those cultures picked that up. The Druids, the Anglos, the Danes, and they had some form or version, as you're going to see as we move through tonight, incorporating some of these type traditions. They would always sing songs of merriment. Mistletoe and holly were also important to these cultures. And then later, many years later, it was the Germanic tribes that incorporated the decoration and lighting the tree with candles, and they did that to honor their god Odin, or Odin. I'm not sure how you say that, y'all. To kind of align or parallel with winter solstice, we have Saturnalia. A lot of people think these are, well, they are very similar, but they're not the same thing. There is a little bit of difference here, because Saturnalia is actually Roman in origin. It was introduced in about 250 to 200 BC, and it was an honor of Saturn, their god of time and agriculture. And so if you think about the time of year at winter solstice, kind of like we talked about at Thanksgiving, this is the time when all the farmers are bringing in their crops. The harvest is pretty well complete. They have entered those dark days. So this was the time of celebration. And this is one of those celebrations that would last about a week too. They would always celebrate on December 17th to about the 23rd. They had feast and gifting and games. So some of that gift exchange has a little bit of roots here in Saturnalia. But again, it's a lot of things that help influence what we celebrate today. Deck the Halls. This is maybe an influence to this song, because during Saturnalia, they would collect holly and make these little wreaths. So what you saw fly in there, they would make it handheld to where you would give friends and neighbors this to commence the occasion. So many people think that the tradition of giving Christmas cards has some roots here with Saturnalia. But they believed holly represented good spirits, and this was spirits that they wanted to invite in to live in their home, to be fruitful for the coming year, because holly was the sacred plant of the Romans and thus their god Saturn. There is an ancient legend, because those of you that are plant people know that the ilex species, which is holly, there's a cornuta and a crenata species. So there on the left is the horn species, and then the smooth or the scallop there on the right. So if you decorated with holly back in the day, or even still today, this legend exists. It's believed that if you are to bring in this rough-edged holly first on Christmas morning to decorate with, then the man would be head of the household for the following year. Flip side, if the smooth edged holly was brought into the house first for decoration, then it would be the female that would rule the house. So it's often been said that you bring in those decorations together on Christmas morning. Better to be safe than sorry. Another plant that has a lot of mystical properties for Saturnalia is just our standard garden ivy, the heterohelix. And I don't know if any of you remember the Christmas carol, The Holly and the Ivy. That's one of the oldest Christmas carols ever written, still in existence today. But the ivy is really important during the winter solstice season, because ivy is one of those plants that lives on long after its host plant has died off. So that was a reminder to these people that life goes on. It's just an endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. If anybody ever has grown this in your gardens, then you can probably see that it does in fact simulate that. So if you were one that practiced in the workings, and this was the time that you would utilize this plant to do that, to improve yourself, and place a barricade basically between you and anything that was toxic to you. So this was the time of year, and this was the plant for which to do that. Again, Saturnalia, that was the most popular holiday on the ancient Roman calendar. It was derived again from those old farming rituals of midwinter and the winter solstice. It was the pagan celebration of Saturn, and it started as a single day, but again, it grew into about a week-long feast. But they began on December 17th because they used the Julian calendar, and that is, there's a little bit of time delay there between the two calendars. This was also the time when they switched places, if you will, with their slaves. So this could go on for almost a month. And you would see a lot of festivities in the street when this would occur. So if you're interested in that, there's some links in the slideshow that will direct you to more of that. You already heard me mention birch a little while ago, but if you think about a forested area, when it burns, one of the first plants that comes back is going to be a birch tree. So that again is going to be a plant that they associated with rebirth and with regeneration. It's also a plant that they saw to help increase fertility and creativity, as well as healing and protection. So you still see the birch utilized in a lot of modern day decorations even today, especially in Celtic celebrations. So it's the first month in the Celtic tree calendar following the winter solstice. This is, what's his name? Odin. This was in Germany. The Germanic people believed that he was the great hunter, and many Germans actually feared him. But he had this wild hunt every year, and it was linked to bad storms. And basically, if you had been bad, it was almost like he knows if you've been bad or good, whatever the song is. That was kind of how people saw Odin, and that could have helped kind of shape some of those traditions even today. But this was both tied to Saturnalia and to Yule, and this is kind of where we've got some historical text that tells us that this could have been the beginnings of where Santa Claus originated, especially in Norse myth. It shows that he often made himself look like an old man and would distribute gifts to the poor people in the community. So kind of a unique story there. I couldn't find a lot on Odin, but there's a few extra links to kind of tie that together. So the big question is, how did some of these old world traditions influence, again, some of our modern day traditions? So hopefully you've already seen some of that starting to take place, but many people believe that our current December holidays were based on those winter solstice celebrations, again, long before Christ was born. It was often said that it was easier to convert people and substitute holidays for those that were used at the same time. So looking toward a late December event. So since then, a lot of these solstice symbols have been incorporated into our modern day traditions. One of those is mistletoe. Many of you have probably seen this in abundance since the leaves have fallen off the trees. We know that this is the old legend of kissing under the mistletoe. Well, this is actually based on an Old Norse legend. And it began with Frigga, who is the Nordic goddess of love and beauty. And then this is her son, Balder, on the left, and he's actually the grandson of Thor. So, of course, Frigga loved her son very dearly. He was, highly thought of amongst all the other the gods. But one day he had this dream, and he dreamed he died. So of course this really upset Frigga. So she goes out and she makes this big proclamation to all the birds of the sky, makes this request to all the plants and animals that roam the earth. And she extracted a promise from them that they would never, ever, under any circumstance, harm her son Balder. So she felt pretty good about this, that she wasn't going to lose her son and his dream wasn't going to come true. But then enter in Loki here, who is the god of lies and mischief that you can see there. He was kind of jealous about that promise. So he started to think about ways that he could kind of get by this promise. So he basically used Balder's blind brother to carry out his mission. But what ended up happening was that he thought, well, the mistletoe isn't a bird of the sky, and it's not a plant that lives, it doesn't have roots that extend into the soil. It's a parasite, basically. So he took the tree or branches of the mistletoe and created this dart, and it actually killed Balder. And so of course this upset Frigga very bad, and the gods had pity on her, and so they actually brought him back to life. But in the meantime, the red berries of the mistletoe turned white because of all her tears for crying over Balder. So that's where the legend of the mistletoe comes from. And when her son was brought back to life, she decreed that anybody that walked underneath the mistletoe should not fight, but put down arms and walk away, and a kiss should be given to all those that walked under it. So with the advent of Christianity, any association with pagan traditions and religions were eventually banned. And so mistletoe kind of lost its place for a long while. But it found its way back, known as the kissing ball. You can kind of see that pictured there. But etiquette is every time that you kiss under the mistletoe, you're supposed to pick off a berry. And then when all the berries are gone, then there's no more kisses to be given. If a maiden refused a kiss under the mistletoe, then she would remain unmarried for another year. And then you have to burn the mistletoe on the 12th night, because if you didn't, then all the kiss maidens again would remain unmarried for another year. So that's just a little fun story about how mistletoe came to be. Along with that, in the Celtic world, the Druids recognized too that the plant did not have roots in the ground. So they deemed it as a very valuable and sacred plant. They would actually dress in white robes. They would cut the mistletoe from the holy oak, so you can kind of see the arbor of trees there in the back. But they would cut the oak or the mistletoe with a golden scythe on the 6th day after the new moon following winter solstice. So there was a timing issue with doing that. They believed that the mistletoe would lose its power if it touched the earth. So they would lay these white blankets, and it had to be white because of the sacred berry, but they would lay this white blanket underneath the tree to catch it. And then they would collect that and distribute sprigs of the mistletoe to all the families in their townships. So again, Christmas that we know today falls around the same time as the solstice holiday of Yule or Saturnalia. And of course, we knew, you've already heard me talk, that they celebrated by bringing in evergreen branches and boughs. And then the Romans, they also did that too. They would bring in to celebrate during Saturnalia and worship Saturn. The Egyptians also did this. I don't have a picture in here and didn't go into detail about those, but the Egyptians would also bring in evergreens, but they used palms because obviously they didn't have our evergreen tree species would not live in Egypt, of course. But we think these traditions are what helped shape our modern day Christmas tree. So Egypt is considered the actual birthplace. Its origin dates way back again before Christ. The reason that the palm tree was considered sacred is because it would put forth a shoot every month, and then a spray of the 12 shoots was what was used in Egypt at this time of year to commence celebration and the festivities. Even though it has its origins in Egypt, it was Germany that really made it popular and kind of what we know today as the Christmas tree, where that evolved. So it was about the 17th century. Historians know that in Northern Europe, so again, Scandinavia, they believed that those evergreens possess those magical and mystical powers. So again, you can kind of see in the corner there, they would bring in these boughs and hang candles, but of course that would be kind of dangerous today. I'm not sure how they did that without catching everything on fire, but they would hang real candles on the tree and decorate with holly and different other kinds of boughs. Some believe that the Christmas tree evolved from the paradise tree of the Middle Ages. It was during the 14th and 15th century that evergreen trees played a role in miracle and mystery plays, if you're familiar with that. So one of those was the fall of Adam and Eve that you see depicted here with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So the paradise tree that you see pictured there is actually an evergreen tree, and it has the red apples hung from the branches. Some also think that Martin Luther was instrumental in bringing the Christmas tree or starting that tradition. But it was, again, the German soldiers that after the American Revolution here in America that actually brought it to the New World soil. Another plant that I know I had not thought about this plant really, its origin in Christmas traditions until doing this presentation, but ginger, that was a very precious herb to Europeans, and it was one of those that the Crusaders brought back in about the 1200s, and it was an instant hit in Europe. They started using it to make the ginger cakes and the ginger cookies. It was known as the grain of paradise or an altar pepper, and it was actually used as a substitute for pepper in the 1300s and 1400s. But it became a solstice favorite. So it was often only utilized during the solstice celebrations in the winter. It was used in teas and gingerbreads. It was used as a flavoring spice for a lot of their favorite meals. And then the first cookies actually originated in Germany in the 1600s that we know as Lebkuchen today. Another reason that we know it became very popular here in the US was when the Brother Grimm's fairy tale, wrote the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel. So this was written right at the turn of the, I think in 1810, 1812, somewhere in there. But it became really, really popular. You know, they were caught by the witch, but they escaped. But it was because of this house. It was made out of gingerbread, and they could eat all the candies off of it. But when this was published is when it became really popular, and this is where the tradition for us to make gingerbread houses actually stemmed from. It was a favorite treat, so they actually had, you know, here we have a lot of ramp festivals in and around this area. There's the woolly worm festivals. You know, any region that's popular for something specific, we tend to name festivals after it. Well, there it was gingerbread. So they had a lot of gingerbread fairs, gingerbread festivals. It's often been rumored that ladies would give knights a piece of their gingerbread for good luck before a tournament. Sometimes they would even superstitiously eat a piece of the gingerbread, and that would improve their chances of obtaining the real thing. But this whole practice of shaping gingerbread into different things that you see here, the hearts and the flowers, birds, animals, all of that, that became really popular all the way into Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Great Britain, and then of course made its way to the New World. English colonists, that dates back. It was one of the first spices to be introduced once the first colonists arrived here in the New World. Just for your entertainment, in the Google Drive, there is a recipe for George Washington's mother's gingerbread cake from 1784. So it was one of the first spices again here on the New World soil to really take off and be a hit. I've spoken a lot about Europe and some of those traditions, so many of you might be wondering about here, the Native Americans. I didn't focus a lot on that, but just to kind of let you know, they did celebrate winter solstice as well. It would kind of vary tribe to tribe, but they felt the longest night should be celebrated each year by dreaming. So they would actually sip these infusions of sleep-inducing plants, and I'm not sure what those were, but they would sip that concoction and dream the night away. So the next day, they would discover, wow, the days are starting to get longer. They would exchange stories about what they had dreamed about, and they knew that that meant that's what would happen for the following year. We can't talk about winter solstice without talking about food, because when we build that bonfire, when we're burning the Yule log, or whether we're engaging in a Saturnalia feast or whatever, food was a big theme for all of these celebrations during the winter solstice. This is a wild boar, so pork was really common as a food item at that time of year. Many farmers, again, at this time of year would cull their herds. They didn't want to have to feed livestock through the winter. So this was the time of year that they had that fresh supply of meat to get them through. They had more meat at this time of year than any other. You probably remember me talking about that during the Thanksgiving talk a few weeks ago. It was also at the same time that the ladies of the house would gather all of their veggies or herbs. You know, we use that word simultaneously from the old world to the new world, but they would harvest and dry all the herbs that they could. At the same time, all these feasts would also try to incorporate fruit that you know, was a little later in being harvested, or you know, stuff that they didn't preserve and utilize for immediate use, then they would use it for this fruit soup during these winter solstice festivals. And kind of along with that, any type of grains, nuts, or berries, all of those foods from the late harvest were incorporated into these feasts. And again, a lot of these feasts were lasting for 12 days. And later on, of course, ginger became a huge hit. And then in Celtic cultures, the just plain Jane round shortbread cookies were, because they represented the sun, were created and served during the winter solstice celebrations. You can't talk about a feast without talking about the wassail. And of course, kind of just like the harvest season, culling out the livestock, the same was true about their fermented beverages, if you will. So any of their wines, beer, ales, or mead that they had been fermenting and creating for that year was now a prime time to be drinking that. So they would incorporate the fruits and the alcoholic beverages and all of this at that time during their feast. I said I was going to talk a lot about Egyptian, but just to kind of mention it, Egypt does celebrate on January 7th. They also fast for a period of 43 days. This is the location of where, and I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about my different religions, but this is where the Coptics celebrate. They have their own church, they do their own thing, and then they refer to Santa Claus as Baba Noel, which means Father Christmas. Christmas was not amongst one of the earliest festivals of the church here, but again, they did in fact still have their own celebrations. And that January 7th, you're going to see as we move on, does directly correlate again with the different calendars, Julian versus Gregorian. So now we're talking a little bit about the timeline. We've went through a lot of different locations, but there's a lot of question as to, is Christmas really the day Jesus was born? Especially today in modern Christianity, we think that we celebrate Christmas because of the Christ child being born on December 25th. But at that time, actually, births were not really celebrated. Easter was actually the main holiday, of course, after Jesus was born, because in the 4th century, church officials decided that, well, you know, this is a big deal and we have all these celebrations going on, so maybe we should acknowledge the day that he was born as well. So because there was all these other winter solstice festivals and Saturnalia festivals going on, they decided, well, actually it was Pope Julius I, proclaimed that December 25th would be the official celebration date for the birthday of Jesus. So you'll notice there that the first Christmas feast was held in Rome in 336 AD. and Christianity had then become the empire's official religion. But just to kind of make mention, the Bible does not mention a date for Jesus Christ's birth. And it was actually later, the Puritans, remember the Pilgrims, they were the ones that really pointed out they denied the legitimacy of this date for a very long time. So many historians think that Jesus was actually born in the spring, because why would shepherds be herding their flocks in the middle of winter? But Pope Julius chose this date, December 25th, because they wanted to adopt and absorb traditions of the pagan celebrations and traditions of Saturnalia. So the first feast here was actually called the Feast of the Nativity, and this was a custom that spread into Egypt by 432 AD, and by the end of the 6th century it was spread all around the world. So when we talk about Christmas, it's actually a condensed version, I guess, of Mass of Christ, or Christmas, Christ Mass. So it kind of got shortened to Christmas. They thought by holding Christmas at the same time every year as these winter solstice festivals, that church leaders thought that they could increase their chances of others, the pagans, adopting their Christian beliefs. But they finally gave up on, how to dictate this being accomplished, because by the Middle Ages, it had by and large replaced pagan religion anyway. So at that time, though, Christians would go to church. They would attend these big carnival-like celebrations afterwards that were kind of similar to what modern day Mardi Gras is today. So it was at that time Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan forces, they took over England, and they vowed that they weren't going to have these big celebrations. It was wrong. They didn't need to be celebrating the birthday of the Christ child in that manner. You've got some varying opinions from different historical contexts here on that, and I put a couple of those links in here, but there for a while there's evidence that Christmas was actually canceled, if you will. So it goes back to the Pilgrims we talked about a few weeks ago, and remember I told you that the Pilgrims were actually separatists. They thought themselves as saints, but they were actually separating from the church. So they were a little bit more orthodox in their beliefs. They didn't want to have Christmas celebrations, so that's why we only hear from the Plymouth colony about the Thanksgiving feast and not necessarily Christmas. So several years they didn't even acknowledge this holiday. But just a few miles further south in Jamestown, where John Smith was at, they did celebrate. There's proof of that, that they did in fact enjoy Christmas traditions. And it's from this tradition that eggnog comes from. I know this is not a plant, but eggnog, you're not sure if it was created and crafted here in the New World, or if it actually was something that started in England and then came across the ocean. There's some varying differences there too, but they think it comes from the old world egg and grog, which was just eggs and a thick cream that they would drink. Lots of different links that I put in the slideshow for you to go back and look on that. But there's even some evidence that they use figs in some of these concoctions. But when it did make its way to the New World, and most people think that it actually began here in America, but they would mix this up in a traditional manner. And I've actually put a George Washington, his own recipe in the Google Drive for you. So one of the biggest things that they would utilize for their alcohol was a Jamaican rum, because it was so much cheaper than any of the whiskey that they would have imported from England. So most of those New World eggnogs here were made with the Jamaican rum. It wasn't until after the American Revolution that English customs fell out of favor, and that was even Christmas, but Christmas wasn't even declared a holiday here in the U.S. until June 26, 1870. So we owe a lot of thanks to some of our modern day authors for kind of revamping Christmas, putting a new spin on it, making it more or less the Christmas that we know today. So this is, oh, what is his name? Washington Irving, that actually wrote this story, The Sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon. And it was just this series of stories that focused on Christmas. And instead of, well, actually, the first police academy, or whatever you want to call it, was actually created in New York City as a result to all the rioting and the Mardi Gras-like celebrations around Christmas time. So his response was that everybody should be able to get along. It should be a peaceful celebration. It needs to be a holiday to bring everybody together. And you know, we need to own this as a time for peace and joy for all. So to kind of go along with that, it was Charles Dickens from England that wrote The Christmas Carol. And those two stories kind of helped spur the modern day Christmas. It kind of put this new image, a rebranding, I guess, if you will, that it wasn't just about going to church and then going out and partying like crazy and having a big time. It was actually a moment for families to come together, and it's kind of cool to see some of those correlations. So we talked a lot about all the way up to Christmas and the birth of Jesus and some of the, you know, timeline after that. But what about some of those holiday plants, and where do they actually have roots in Christmas? So this one is English pennyroyal. Sometimes you're going to hear it called pennyroyal, mosquito plant even. It just kind of depends on what region you're in. But this is a member of the mint family. A lot of people think it smells like spearmint, but it was placed in the manger on the night of the Christ child's birth. And it's been said to have burst into bloom the moment that Jesus was born. Another plant, you've heard me talking about this one multiple times, many classes that I've taught, but this is the rosemary, and of course it is an evergreen. It does have a delightful scent, looks beautiful decorations. But according to folklore, rosemary brings happiness for the coming year of anyone who smells it. It's also said, I think some of you have probably seen that presentation, but during the flight of Egypt, Mary said that she spread her child's garments on a rosemary plant to dry, and the flowers, which were originally white, turned blue. And that's why they have the sweet scent they do today. The other legend to that was that she threw her blue cloak on a rosemary plant, and that's why the flowers turn blue. So a few little different legends there on the rosemary. But again, one of the traditions is just sniffing rosemary, and it'll bring happiness for the new year. So I think after we log off tonight, we all need to go find us some rosemary and sniff away, because we really want to have a COVID-free year in 2021. This is thyme, or the wild thyme, and of course it had a lot of medicinal properties, especially antiseptic properties, and it was burned as an incense by the ancient Greeks. It's a very popular culinary herb today, but this is one that was collected from the fields outside of Bethlehem to make that soft bed for Mary during the birth of Jesus. Lavender is one that we all know and love, but it was used by the Virgin Mary to dye Jesus's swaddling clothes because she spread them on a bed of wild lavender. Another plant that comes into play is the pine tree, because it was said that it was one of the plants that Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus used as a shelter when they were being pursued by Herod's soldiers. She was too weak to travel any further, so the pine tree basically just embraced them up and kept them safe as the soldiers went by. Also, if you were to cut open a pine cone lengthwise, you'll see the handprint of the baby Jesus, because it was said that he blessed the pine tree for saving them from Herod. The other plant that kind of goes along with that same story is the sage plant. It was also said to be the one that Mary and the baby Jesus hid from. So I don't know if it's pine or sage. I put that in here for both, and there's documentation for both of those. Sage is known as the herb of immortality, so it does have a lot of religious legends. You've seen me speak to those two in previous classes, but it is very, very symbolic at Christmas time. Another popular one is chamomile because it's a symbol of patience and an energy in adversity. So it was one of the plants that Joseph was said to have picked for Mary to lay upon to give birth. Another one of those plants that was also used for that was the lady's bedstraw. And then, of course, we've already mentioned these, but the lavender, chamomile, and thyme, those are symbols of bravery, courage, and endurance. And those were the three traits that Jesus was going to need in his life. And they were said to have all been placed in the manger for the Christ child to sleep upon. Maybe some of you recognize this. This is frankincense. I don't know if you can really tell it here on the left, but very spiny, thorny, is a boogery little plant. But you can see what that latex or that sap looks like. And then myrrh, also another spiny little plant. But of course, frankincense and myrrh were the two resins that were brought to Jesus by the wise men along with gold. So both were considered rare and valuable gifts. Myrrh was used for incense, perfumes, and medicine, and it was believed to strengthen children. And frankincense was thought to drive away evil and considered a plant of prayer and sacrifice. And you can tell by looking at both of those why it would be useful in driving away evil. So, a few others that we need to mention are the snow rose. And there's a couple of links in here as to specifics on the snow rose, but it is known as the traditional Christmas flower. It's an excellent edible flower for this time of year. And you'll see there it's also called the winter rose. And those are, according to legend, linked to the birth of Christ. And there is a story about Madeline. It's a really long and lengthy story, but I put that in there for you. So it's a really good little story to read, especially if you have kids at Christmas. The amaryllis, and most, or more specifically, the red amaryllis. The red has its roots in the traditional custom, but now we know we can get these in all colors. But the red was the most significant because it represented pride, beauty, and love. It did stem from Greek mythology, and you can read the story there. The red flower bloomed from the spot where her blood hit the ground, and they kissed, and what a great nature romance novel. But kind of like I said in the notes, I think there's probably, easier and less painful ways to prove your love to someone. But this is the Christmas cactus, and we probably all got one of these blooming right now. Different cactuses, the Thanksgiving and the Christmas cactus. But this is the succulent perennial that comes to us from Brazil, and it's almost considered a parasite to some where it grows natively. But they have been extensively hybridized, so you're going to get those in a multitude of colors. And they do, they are pollinated by birds. So very beautiful to have during the Christmas season. Just kind of a recap of what some of these flowers represent. Holly represents good luck. Mistletoe, romance. The yew represents everlasting life. The ivy represents growth. The Christmas tree represents hope. And then a Christmas cactus has been said to represent answered prayers. Of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the poinsettia. I put a lot of links in the slideshow for you to refer back to on this one. So this one is a plant that comes to us from a different part of the world. It actually comes to us from Mexico, 14th century. It has a long history of being a medicinal plant. It was used for its latex, or that milky white sap that you get when you break the bracts open. But they were said it could, in Mexico, they said it could quell fevers. And you can see why I didn't include this on the agenda either, because I'm not going to attempt to try to say this, but the ancient cultures there, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas all referred to it as this word right here. But it was a very highly prized plant in this culture. And Montezuma himself loved this plant. He would have this plant growing anywhere that he was close. So if you've ever been to Mexico, you've probably seen this plant growing in the wild there. It can actually get very tall, even though it doesn't really grow well at the higher altitudes, which was another reason Montezuma, anytime he traveled, he would take flowers back with him. But a really good story is the Flowers of the Holy Night, which is the poinsettia. Franciscan monks began using this plant in their nativity processions in Mexico. So it was also centered around the same time of year as Pepita and the Flowers of the Holy Night. So that was one way that the story or the plant came to be in Christmas traditions, because Pepita was traveling to the nativity scene at the chapel. She didn't have enough money to buy a gift. So she picked these weeds off the side of the road and took them to present to the baby Jesus in the nativity. But she knew it was a humble gift, but she wanted to make sure that she brought him something. So when she presented this bouquet to the nativity Jesus, the bouquet of roadside weeds burst into a beautiful bouquet of red flowers that we know today. But it was this man, Joel Roberts Poinsett. He was from South Carolina, and he was actually the first ambassador to Mexico that actually brought the poinsettia from Mexico here. He had a greenhouse that he would play with the poinsettia and figured out how to take cuttings and realized that they started blooming here right around Christmas time, and started distributing those as gifts. And that was kind of when the poinsettia really took off here in the US. So that kind of brings us to Santa Claus. We got to mention, if we're talking about holidays, we got to talk about Santa Claus. And again, I've already talked about how Auden could have been one of the first figures for Father Christmas. But historical records take the real Santa Claus back to modern day Turkey, believe it or not. That he was actually Saint Nicholas. He was a Christian monk that was living there. They don't know specifically when his death was, but they celebrate his death every year very robustly because of all the good that he distributed in and around those communities while he was there. He would stop violent storms. He would donate money to fathers to get their daughters out of prostitution. He would help, again, quell storms to save sailors. So lots of good things that he did for a multitude of different types of people. In the Netherlands, Santa Claus kind of took on this Dutch-friendly look, and they call him Sinterklaas. This is where we think that Santa Claus kind of came to us from the Dutch settlers that inhabited in the Hudson River Valley. So if you remember, in 1809, Washington Irving wrote this, or showed this portly Dutchman flying through the sky in a wagon that was dropping gifts down the chimney. So all of this started kind of melding together. And then you'll see here, Clement Seymour wrote "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which is called A Visit from St. Nicholas. So he kind of changed the wagon to the 8 tiny reindeer, and that's kind of how it stuck. The vision of Santa Claus in this iconic red suit, and having his sack there with all of his toys, that was kind of commemorated by this artist, Thomas Nast. And so taking all those together, that's the creation that we ended up with today. So around the world, lots of different names for Santa Claus. You can see some of those mentioned there: Papa Noel, Santa Claus, Father Christmas, even some areas in, let's see, Thailand don't celebrate Christmas, but some of the Japanese culture, some Christians in Japan do celebrate that. Black Peter, Saint Nicholas, and the Christ kind. And kind of go along with that, you can see the dark brown shaded here is not a holiday, and then the tan, it's not a holiday, but it's given as an observance. Everywhere else that you see shaded in gray celebrate Christmas in some form or other. So about 160 countries worldwide. Some countries, again, are going to celebrate different times, because, again, that difference in the church, or the Eastern Orthodox churches celebrate January 7th. So there's a little difference in the date, but they all celebrate Christmas. Just to include a little bit of lore, and again, kind of maybe bringing in the new year. If you eat an apple on Christmas Eve, it's going to bring you good health for the next year. If you buy anyone's shoes, or if anybody buys you shoes, don't wear them on Christmas Day. It'll bring you bad luck. If it snows on Christmas, then that means Easter will be green. And then you don't want to hear the animals, conversing amongst themselves in the barn, or that's going to be impending doom for you. If you have a clear star-filled night on Christmas Eve, that's going to bring good crops for the following summer. And then you'll notice this one kind of goes back to the fogs in August that we talked about a month ago, but the number of the day that the first major snowstorm occurs indicates the number of major snowstorms that year. So I don't think tonight or today's event is going to constitute maybe as a major snowstorm, but I think I'm going to go with, no, I don't want to go with it. Today's the 30th. Yeah, we don't want to go with that number today, but anyway, that'll kind of help you keep track of that. Are you a Christmas baby? If you are, it's said that you'll never encounter evil spirits that are ever bent on doing you harm, and you can never die. If you were born on Christmas Day, you can't die from drowning or hanging. So maybe go be a pirate. I'm not going to read all these because I've already talked about a lot of these, and I'm going to get you out of here. I'm already in an hour, so you can go back and refer to these. But we did talk a lot about these already throughout the presentation. I do want to get to a few more things. So as far as the colors and why we associate the red, green, blue, and all that, the color green is actually considered the color of life and mystery, even before Jesus was born. Again, it goes back to those Old Norse legends, the Celts and the Druids, Anglos. All of those cultures believed that green represented life. Red represents the birth of Jesus, his blood and his death. So that's one reason that people started adding the red berries from the holly tree. They wanted to incorporate those, and even from the yew, into their decoration to signify that. Gold, of course, that's light and sunshine to get us through the dark days of winter. White was said that Jesus is spotless, sinless, and pure. So this again, he brought light, and thus at Christmas, the days start getting longer. The shade of blue, you've heard me mention that with her cloak fleeing Egypt, turning the rosemary flowers from white to blue. Blue is associated with Mary. And at one time, blue was actually more expensive than gold. Blue dye was more expensive. So this is kind of what we see as a modern day Christmas, but a lot of these traditions that you see in this one picture here have come to us from years and years and years of cultures and traditions meshing from many cultures, many different peoples around the world. One thing that we don't want to forget too is just the food, because where would we be at this time of year without all the food that we eat? So just to make mention of a few of those, of course, if we didn't have wheat, we wouldn't have flour for cookies. I know some of you can argue that point with almond and coconut flours, but just humor me for a few minutes here. No cacao or chocolate, we wouldn't have that fabulous Christmas fudge. If we didn't have sugar cane or sugar beets, that Yule log I was talking about, we wouldn't have nothing to sweeten all those cakes and candies and cookies. If we didn't have ginger, we wouldn't have gingerbread houses, gingerbread cookies. And of course, if we didn't have fruit growing everywhere, then we would all be just lost if we didn't have the traditional Christmas fruit cake. And of course, mint, peppermint, mentha piperita for candy canes. And then we got to think about our good old mulling spices. We want to combine all those spices for wassail. I didn't talk a lot about spices tonight, but there's a whole list of our traditional Christmas spices and some of their origin and what they're used for that's in the Google Drive. And then, of course, cinnamon. Think about breakfast cinnamon rolls, if you will. But no matter what you celebrate, December 25th, January 7th, December 17th, whenever it is, or December 21st, you know, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Let's not forget about Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Ramadan, all of those. It's just a joyous time of year. It's a one time maybe we can all come together and kind of put 2020 behind us and maybe bring in a great and prosperous 2021, if you will. So everybody make sure you sniff rosemary tonight. That's your one homework assignment that you've got to do. We all want a good 2021. With that said, that kind of finishes up that presentation, but I'll get the document uploaded into the Google Drive. Most of the other documents are already in there, so you can access those. You should already have an email from Qualtrics that houses the survey or evaluation. So if you've been to one class out of the 29, or if you've been to all 29, it doesn't matter. Make sure you go in there and fill out that survey, because that's going to help guide us for planning in 2021. And you've only got 2 weeks to get it done. So make sure you do. If you, oh, I see Patty, she's sniffing rosemary. Way to go, girl. But make sure you get that done in the next 2 weeks. You're going to keep getting an email like every 3 or 4 days if you don't do it. So just go ahead and do it. You're wrapping it up. You got it right there at your fingertips. And I really value your input. So make sure you do that. But with all,
thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really very, very enjoyable. This was a highlight of my year.
Well, good. I'm so glad you said that. It's really been one of mine too. I've really looked forward to all these Mondays, and I've learned a lot too. I've learned a lot. So, you know, I'm glad that y'all kind of stayed on me and, you know, done those other 2 evaluations earlier in the year, because you really kind of pushed me out of my comfort zone too, because I had no idea. So thank y'all. But
Happy holidays.
Thank you, and happy holidays to all of y'all. I hope you have a great December, and you know, I don't know when we're going to reconvene. I won't know that till I get those results in. So you'll probably be hearing from me about the first of the year, if not before. So thank you all so much for hanging in there. Be safe, and we'll see you all in 2021.